The stranger's boots hit the boardwalk of desolate Redemption Gulch like the fall of a hammer, each step echoing the town's dying heartbeat. He is Silas Blackwood, a name whispered with awe and fear across the territories, a man who collects towns like other men collect butterflies or rare coins. Redemption Gulch, bankrupt, parched, and broken, is his latest acquisition, its name a bitter irony lost on no one. Mayor Thompson, a man whose shoulders slump with the weight of every unpaid bill, every abandoned storefront, every hungry child's hollow gaze, signs the papers laid out on a rough-hewn barrel, his trembling hand smudging the ink. The town, lock, stock, and barrel now belongs to Blackwood. Everything, everyone. Or so Blackwood assumes, his gaze sweeping over the dusty, sun-baked street and the few dejected souls who have gathered to witness their collective surrender. But then his eyes snag on a figure standing apart from the small, despairing knot of townsfolk. Ilara Vance, the mayor's daughter, her dress faded but clean, her posture ramrod straight. She does not look downcast. Her gaze, the color of a stormy sky, is fixed on him, blazing with a fierce, untamed fire that the desert sun has failed to quench. Her father, his face a mask of weary resignation, gestures weakly towards her, a silent, almost pleading offering, as if presenting the last, perhaps most valuable, asset of Redemption Gulch. Blackwood's lips curve in a humorless line of acknowledgement, but before he can speak, before the transaction can be thus implicitly completed, Ilara's chin lifts a fraction higher. "The town may be for sale, Mr. Blackwood." Her voice cuts through the dusty silence, clear and steady as a prairie river, but I am not. There's more to Ilara Vance than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. And with those words, Silas Blackwood, a man accustomed to acquiring whatever he desired with the cold precision of a well-aimed rifle, faced his first unsolvable equation in Redemption Gulch. His life and hers had just become irrevocably entangled, though neither could yet fathom the depths of that entanglement. The dust raised by Blackwood's arrival and the heavier pall of the town's sale had begun to settle, though the air remained thick with unspoken anxieties. Silas Blackwood was not a man given to idle pronouncements or wasted movements. His reputation preceded him, a financier from the East, some said, who had amassed a fortune through means both shrewd and, at times, rumored to be ruthless. He'd bought failing railroads, defunct silver mines, and now, entire towns teetering on the brink of oblivion. Why? No one in Redemption Gulch could rightly say. Some whispered he was building an empire, a network of holdings that would one day rival the government itself. Others, more charitable or perhaps more desperate, hoped he was a peculiar sort of philanthropist, breathing life back into forgotten places. Silas himself offered no explanations. He was a tall man, built leanly but with a wiry strength that spoke of a life not entirely spent behind ledgers and mahogany desks. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, dominated by eyes as grey and cool as a winter morning, eyes that missed nothing and conceded even less. He'd come to Redemption Gulch alone, save for a single taciturn assistant who handled his correspondence and logistical needs, a man named Mr. Finch, as dry and precise as his employer. Redemption Gulch had once been a hopeful speck on the territorial map. Gold, or rather the rumor of it, had birthed it. A small, stubborn stream, optimistically named Prosperity Creek, had trickled nearby, enough to sustain the first flush of miners and the businesses that inevitably followed. But the gold had proven elusive, a mere dusting in the pan, and Prosperity Creek had dwindled with each passing dry season until it was little more than a muddy scar in the cracked earth. The railroad, the great artery of the West, had bypassed them by 50 miles, a death knell that echoed in the hollowed-out stores and the silent, rusting machinery of the long-abandoned Hopeful Heart mine. Now, it was a place where hope came to die, its inhabitants clinging on through sheer stubbornness or lack of means to go elsewhere. Dust was the primary crop, and despair the most common currency. Ilara Vance knew every crack in the boardwalk, every peeling paint sign, every weary face in Redemption Gulch. She had been born there, in the small clapboard house behind the mayor's office, a house that was now, like everything else, technically owned by Silas Blackwood. Her mother had succumbed to a fever when Ilara was 10, leaving her to become the quiet, efficient mistress of her father's small household and, in many ways, the keeper of his conscience. She'd had some schooling from a traveling preacher who'd stayed a season, enough to read and write proficiently, and a keen mind that absorbed the harsh lessons of their environment. She'd watched the town shrink, its vitality seeping away like water into the arid soil. She loved its people, even in their flaws and their current state of beaten surrender. Her father, Mayor Thaddeus Vance, was a good man, honest to a fault, but overwhelmed by the relentless decline. He saw Blackwood's arrival as a grim sort of salvation, a drowning man's grasp for any offered hand, no matter how cold. Ilara, however, saw only a different kind of predator, one who traded in lives and livelihoods instead of gold or cattle. The initial days after the signing were marked by a tense, watchful quiet. Blackwood established himself in the town's only hotel, a dilapidated two-story structure whose sign, the Golden Prospect, now seemed a cruel joke. He and Finch were methodical, poring over the town's meager records, deeds, outstanding debts, lists of remaining citizenry. Scornful glances followed Ilara when she walked down Main Street, not from Blackwood, who barely seemed to register her physical presence after their initial confrontation, but from some of the townsfolk. Jedediah Smith, the owner of the mercantile, whose shelves were more dust than goods, had bowed so low before Blackwood, he'd nearly scraped his nose on the man's polished boots. He'd later eyed Ilara with a mixture of fear and disapproval, as if her defiance might somehow jeopardize their new owner's fragile benevolence. "Best not to rile him, girl," he'd muttered, his voice raspy. "He's all we got left." Ilara had merely tightened her lips and walked on, her spine stiff. Their shared life, if it could be called that, was confined to the oppressive smallness of Redemption Gulch. The Blackwood presence permeated everything. The air itself seemed to crackle with a new, unwelcome energy. Evenings in the Vance household, once filled with the mayor's tired sighs and Ilara's quiet hum as she mended or read, were now strained. Her father would recount Blackwood's latest inquiries or directives, his voice a mixture of apprehension and a desperate, flickering hope. Ilara listened, her heart a cold knot. She feared this man, not for what he might do to her physically, but for what he represented, the absolute power to erase their identity, to remold their lives according to his whims, all under the guise of rescue. The sparse cabin felt smaller, the difficult land outside more menacing, and the quiet evenings were heavy with the unspoken challenge she had thrown at Silas Blackwood's feet. The first direct tremor from Blackwood's new regime reached Ilara a week after his arrival. It wasn't a grand decree, but a small, almost insignificant alteration that struck at the heart of what little community remained. He'd sent word via Mr. Pleasantseas with Cassio draw. Finch, Blackwood rarely delivered his own edicts to the general populace, that the old schoolhouse, a single-room building that had stood empty for 2 years after the last teacher left, was to be converted into a storage facility for supplies he intended to bring in. For most, this was a minor point. The schoolhouse was a symbol of better days, but no children currently attended it. For Ilara, it was a violation. She had spent countless hours there as a child, and later had used it herself to teach basic literacy to a few of the younger children whose parents couldn't afford to send them away. It held memories, yes, but more than that, it held the ghost of a promise, that Redemption Gulch might one day educate its young again. She found Blackwood exiting the hotel, preparing to survey the northern edge of town where the creek bed lay. She stood before him, blocking his path, her hands clenched at her sides. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice low but firm. He stopped, his grey eyes assessing her with that unnerving stillness. "Miss Vance, it was not a question." "The schoolhouse," she said. "You can't simply turn it into a warehouse. It means something to this town." A faint, almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth was his only reaction. "It is an unused building, Miss Vance. It is structurally sound. I require storage. It is practical." "Practicality isn't the only measure of worth," Ilara countered, a flush rising on her cheeks. "There are other empty buildings. The old assay office, the livery stables are half empty." "They are not as suitable for my purposes," he stated, his tone final. He made to step around her. Ilara moved slightly, still in his way. "And what are your purposes, Mr. Blackwood, beyond owning us all?" For the first time, a flicker of something other than cool detachment crossed his face. Annoyance, perhaps, or was it a glint of grudging interest? "My purposes, Miss Vance, are to make this town viable, or, failing that, to salvage what assets remain. The schoolhouse is now my asset, to use as I see fit." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "Are you always this, contrary?" "Only when faced with blatant disregard for things that matter," she retorted. He actually almost smiled then, a brief, surprising quirk of his lips. "Consider your objection noted." He then did step around her, his long strides carrying him away down the dusty street, leaving Ilara feeling both frustrated and strangely invigorated. He hadn't budged an inch, yet he had acknowledged her. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a complete dismissal either. The schoolhouse, she knew, was likely lost. But Silas Blackwood now knew, if he hadn't before, that Ilara Vance was not simply another dusty fixture in the town he had bought. She was a voice, and she intended to use it. The quiet defiance she nurtured was a small, flickering candle against the vast darkness of his power, yet it was hers, and she would not let it be snuffed out. Blackwood's changes began to ripple through Redemption Gulch, subtle at first, then with increasing momentum. He didn't tear down, not initially. He assessed, he catalogued. Teams of surveyors, men as grim-faced and efficient as Finch, arrived on the morning stage, fanning out to measure plots, inspect foundations, and test the brackish water from the town well. Blackwood himself was a constant presence, walking the perimeter, peering into abandoned mine shafts, his gaze lingering on the parched fields that had once grown something other than scrub and despair. He spoke little to the townsfolk, his interactions usually filtered through Finch or conveyed in curt directives posted on the door of the hotel. Ilara watched him. From the window of her father's office, as she helped with the dwindling mayoral duties that Blackwood had not yet absorbed, she observed the new owner. He was an enigma. He moved with a purpose that was almost unnerving in a town that had forgotten the meaning of the word. He seemed to need little sleep, his lamp often burning in the hotel window long after the rest of Redemption Gulch was shrouded in darkness. She saw him once, at dawn, standing alone on the bluff overlooking the town, the rising sun catching the silver in his dark hair. He wasn't looking at the town with the possessive pride of a landowner, she thought, but with the focused intensity of a chess master studying a complex board, weighing every move, anticipating every consequence. Her resistance to him remained, a hard kernel of defiance in her chest, but it was now tinged with a reluctant curiosity. What did he truly intend for them? Was he merely a vulture, picking over the bones of their failure? Or was there something more, something that his cold exterior concealed? Her father, meanwhile, oscillated between nervous hope and profound anxiety. He asked about the old irrigation plans today, Ilara. Mayor Vance would say, his voice hushed with a kind of awe. "The ones your grandfather drew up. Said they were ambitious but flawed." Or, Finch mentioned they might bring in new seed, drought, resistant. Imagine, girl, crops again. Ilara would nod, offering a non-committal sound, her own hopes carefully leashed. One afternoon, as Ilara was tending the small, struggling vegetable patch behind their house, one of the few places in Redemption Gulch where anything green still fought for life, Blackwood appeared at the rickety gate. He didn't speak, merely stood there, watching her work the dry soil with a small hand trowel. The silence stretched, broken only by the caw of a distant crow and the scrape of her trowel against a stone. Finally she straightened, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, meeting his gaze directly. "Is there something you need, Mr. Blackwood?" "This land," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, his gaze sweeping over her meager rows of beans and wilting tomatoes. "It's poor. The water table is too low here." "I'm aware," Ilara replied, a touch of defensiveness in her tone, "but it's what we have." "There's a small aquifer to the northeast," he stated, not asked. "Deeper than your town well. My surveyors located it yesterday." Ilara felt a flicker of surprise. She knew of old tales, whispers of a hidden spring in that direction, but no one had ever found it, or had the means to dig deep enough. "And it could potentially irrigate a few hundred acres if managed correctly," he continued, his eyes still on the parched earth at her feet. Enough for subsistence, perhaps a small surplus. A seed of something fragile and dangerous. Hope tried to sprout in Ilara's chest. She tamped it down. "Are you planning to drill a new well, Mr. Blackwood?" He looked at her then, his grey eyes unreadable. "I am considering all options to make this investment productive." He paused. "Your grandfather's irrigation plans. Your father mentioned you have them." "I do," she admitted, wary. "I would like to see them." It was a statement, not a request, but devoid of the harsh command she might have expected. She hesitated for a moment. Those plans were a piece of her family's history, a dream that had died with the creek. To hand them over to this man felt like another surrender. But then what was the alternative? Let them gather more dust. "I'll fetch them," she said quietly. As she turned towards the house, she felt his gaze on her back, cool and appraising. When she returned with the rolled-up, brittle schematics, he took them carefully, his long fingers surprisingly gentle with the fragile paper. He unrolled them on the flat top of a weathered barrel, studying the faded ink lines in silence. Ilara stood beside him, a strange tension humming between them. He understood the contours of the land, Blackwood said after a long moment, his finger tracing a proposed channel. But he underestimated the evaporation rates and the soil porosity here. He looked up at her. He had vision, though. It was the closest thing to a compliment she had heard him utter about anyone or anything in Redemption Gulch. "He loved this valley," Ilara said, her voice softer than she intended. Blackwood re-rolled the plans carefully. "Vision without resources is merely a dream, Miss Vance, and dreams don't fill bellies or pay debts." He handed the schematics back to her. "Thank you for your time." He nodded curtly and was gone, leaving Ilara staring at the plans in her hands, a confusing mix of emotions churning within her. He was still the cold, calculating businessman, yet he had seen the worth in her grandfather's failed dream, and for a fleeting moment she had seen a glimpse of something beyond the ruthless tycoon. The uneasy truce, if it could be called that, between Ilara's quiet defiance and Blackwood's pragmatic overhaul of Redemption Gulch was shattered by the arrival of Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a name that carried its own particular brand of notoriety in the territory, a land speculator with a reputation for bullying small landowners and snapping up distressed properties for pennies on the dollar. He arrived in a flashy buggy, all polished brass and swagger, accompanied by two hard-faced men who looked like they were more comfortable with Colt revolvers than with land deeds. He'd apparently heard of Blackwood's acquisition and, smelling opportunity, had come to see if there were any peripheral claims or water rights he could contest or purchase cheaply from the new, presumably overwhelmed, owner. His presence cast an immediate pall over the town. If Blackwood was a cold, distant force, Thorne was a palpable, oily threat. Thorne made his displeasure known quickly when he discovered Blackwood intended to develop the aquifer to the northeast. He claimed, through a series of dubiously acquired, decades-old papers, to have a prior lien on any undeveloped water sources within a 10-mile radius of the now-defunct Hopeful Heart mine, a claim that conveniently encompassed the newly discovered aquifer. The townsfolk, already skittish, grew visibly more agitated. They might resent Blackwood's high-handed ownership, but Thorne represented a descent into outright exploitation. Blackwood met Thorne in the dusty, barren square that passed for the town center. Most of Redemption Gulch watched from the boardwalks or the shadowed doorways of their businesses, a silent, anxious audience. Ilara stood with her father near the mayor's office, her heart pounding. Thorne, florid-faced and exuding false bonhomie, spread his hands. "Mr. Blackwood, a pleasure. Always good to meet a fellow man of enterprise." His eyes, small and shrewd, flickered over Blackwood. "I hear you've taken a shine to our little Redemption Gulch. Admirable, admirable, though perhaps a touch ambitious." Blackwood's expression remained impassive. "State your business, Thorne." "Business, yes. Always business," Thorne chuckled, though his eyes were cold. "It seems your surveyors have stumbled upon a little spring that falls under a prior claim of mine. An unfortunate oversight, I'm sure, but easily rectified. For a modest sum, of course, I'd be willing to relinquish my interest." He named a figure that made several onlookers gasp. Blackwood didn't blink. "Your claim is fraudulent, Thorne. Those papers aren't worth the ink they're printed with." Thorne's smile tightened. "Strong words, Blackwood. I have a signed affidavit from Judge Miller himself, affirming the validity of these documents. Judge Miller was known throughout the territory for his flexible interpretation of the law, particularly when well compensated. A judge whose signature can be bought as easily as a drink in a cheap saloon, Blackwood retorted, his voice like chipped ice. The tension in the square was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thorne's two men shifted, their hands hovering near their hips. It was then that Ilara, unable to remain silent, stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and carrying despite the tremor she felt inside. "Those water rights, if they ever existed, were tied to the operation of the Hopeful Heart. The mine has been closed for 20 years. The claim, by its own terms, would have lapsed with the mine's declared abandonment." Thorne whirled on her, his face purpling. "And who might you be, little lady, to be poking your nose into men's affairs?" "This is my town, Mr. Thorne," Ilara said, her chin high, "and that water is its future. My grandfather, Mayor Josiah Vance, was instrumental in drafting the original charter for the Hopeful Heart. I've read those documents. There's a reversion clause. Upon cessation of mining operations for a period exceeding 5 years, all ancillary rights, including undeveloped water claims, revert to the township or its legal successor." A stunned silence fell. Thorne sputtered, for once at a loss for words. Blackwood's gaze, unreadable as ever, shifted to Ilara, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in their depths. He hadn't known about the reversion clause. It was a detail buried deep in archaic legal documents that his team, for all their efficiency, had likely overlooked, focusing on more recent claims. Thorne recovered his bluster. "Preposterous. A fabrication. You have no proof." "The original charter documents are lodged with the Territorial Records Office in Prescott," Ilara stated calmly, "and I have my grandfather's copies in our house. They are quite clear." Blackwood spoke then, his voice cutting through Thorne's angry protests. "It seems Miss Vance has a more thorough understanding of local history and its legal ramifications than your hired judge, Thorne. I suggest you take your fraudulent papers and your hired guns and leave Redemption Gulch. Now." There was a new edge to his voice, a steely authority that brooked no argument. Thorne looked from Blackwood's implacable face to Ilara's steady gaze, then at the suddenly less cowed faces of the townsfolk. He saw his bluff had been called, his attempt at extortion thwarted by the unexpected intervention of the mayor's daughter. With a string of muttered curses, he signaled to his men, climbed back into his buggy, and with a vicious crack of the whip, departed Redemption Gulch in a cloud of dust and fury, leaving behind a silence that was slowly, tentatively, being filled with murmurs of relief and admiration for Ilara. Blackwood turned to Ilara. The square was still quiet, all eyes on them. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice back to its usual cool reserve, yet with an undertone she couldn't quite decipher. "You continue to be resourceful." "I simply know my home, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, meeting his gaze. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Indeed." He turned and walked back towards the hotel, leaving Ilara standing there, the town's quiet hero. She had not only defended their water, their lifeline, but she had done so with a courage and knowledge that had momentarily eclipsed even Silas Blackwood's power. The dynamic between them had shifted again, subtly but profoundly. He had needed her, her specific knowledge, her deeply rooted connection to this place. And in that moment of shared victory against a common, lesser foe, something fragile, like the first shoot of green in parched earth, had begun to push its way through the hard ground of their animosity. The townsfolk looked at her with new respect, and perhaps for the first time, Silas Blackwood saw her not as an impediment or a curiosity, but as an unforeseen, and possibly invaluable, asset to his grand, enigmatic project. The fight for Redemption Gulch's soul was far from over, but Ilara Vance had just won a significant battle. The incident with Thorne acted as a catalyst. Blackwood, though he never openly acknowledged Ilara's contribution beyond that brief, almost grudging comment, began to consult her, albeit indirectly at first. Questions would arrive via Mr. Finch. "Mr. Blackwood wishes to know Miss Vance's opinion on the old trade routes." Or, "Miss Vance's knowledge of local flora suitable for drought conditions would be appreciated." Ilara, surprised but wary, provided the information, always factually, always maintaining a careful distance. She understood that Blackwood was a pragmatist. If her knowledge could save him time or resources, he would use it. She didn't mistake it for friendship, or even respect in the conventional sense. It was, she suspected, merely an extension of his inventory. She was now a known resource, filed away for future utility. Yet, small changes were occurring within her as well. She found herself observing Blackwood with less animosity and more complexity. He was still an autocrat, the man who owned their lives, but he was also the man who was methodically planning to drill for water, who was inquiring about drought-resistant crops, who had, without fanfare, arranged for a shipment of medical supplies for Doc Carruthers, whose own stock had dwindled to almost nothing. These weren't the actions of a mere vulture. These were the actions of a builder, albeit a remote and unsentimental one. Her internal conflict deepened. Her loyalty to Redemption Gulch was absolute, but her understanding of the man who now controlled its destiny was becoming increasingly muddled. Was it possible to resist the owner while still hoping for the success of his endeavors, knowing that the town's survival was inextricably linked to him? The drilling for the new well at the Northeast Aquifer began. It was a massive undertaking, requiring specialized equipment brought in by mule train and a crew of rough, experienced well diggers. Blackwood oversaw the operation personally, spending long hours under the relentless sun, his shirt sweat-stained, his face grimed with dust. Ilara, delivering a message from her father one afternoon, found him conferring with the crew foreman, his voice sharp with technical questions, his hands gesturing to illustrate a point about strata and pressure. He looked less like a distant financier and more like an engineer, a man comfortable with the grit and toil of physical labor. He saw her approach, nodded curtly, and returned to his discussion. But later, as she was leaving, he called out, "Miss Vance." She turned. "The soil here," he said, gesturing to the excavated earth. "It's richer than anticipated at this depth. Good for root crops if the water holds." "Carrots, potatoes," she murmured, almost to herself, then met his eyes. "Perhaps." He merely nodded again, a strange, almost shared moment of agricultural speculation hanging in the dry air between them, before he turned back to the noisy machinery. The external threat of Thorn had receded, but an internal one began to simmer. Some of the townsfolk, particularly those who had been quickest to curry favor with Blackwood, started to view Ilara's influence, however small, with suspicion and a touch of jealousy. Martha Higgins, whose husband ran the failing blacksmith shop, cornered Ilara outside the mercantile. "Some say you've got Mr. Blackwood's ear now, Ilara," she said, her voice sharp with insinuation. "Hope you're telling him what's best for all of us, not just filling his head with your grandfather's old dreams." Ilara felt a surge of anger. "I tell Mr. Blackwood the truth, Martha, when he asks for it, and my grandfather's dreams were for this town, not against it." The encounter left a bitter taste. The very people she sought to protect were now questioning her motives, seeing her not as a defender but as a potential collaborator with the man they still largely feared. The precarious balance she was trying to maintain, fighting for the town's soul while navigating the reality of Blackwood's ownership, was becoming more difficult. The emotional risk was growing. She was investing her knowledge, her insights, into Blackwood's plans, and with it, a sliver of her fiercely guarded hope. If he failed, or if his ultimate intentions proved destructive, the betrayal would be doubly painful. One evening, a dust storm blew in, a furious, suffocating precursor to the real crisis that was brewing. It wasn't the storm itself, though it raged for hours, rattling windows and forcing everyone indoors, but what it revealed in its aftermath. When the winds finally died down and the thick, ochre haze began to clear, a thin plume of smoke was visible to the west, rising against the bruised twilight sky. Fire. And it was moving fast, fanned by the lingering winds, heading straight for the driest, most vulnerable edge of Redemption Gulch, the very area where the new well-drilling operation was concentrated, along with its precious, newly arrived equipment. Panic erupted. The town had no organized fire brigade, only a collection of old buckets and a desperate prayer for rain that never seemed to come. Mayor Vance wrung his hands, his face ashen. Men shouted, women cried, children clung to their mothers. It was chaos. Through it all, Blackwood was a figure of cold, decisive action. He emerged from the hotel, his face set, and began issuing orders, his voice cutting through the rising hysteria. "Finch, gather every able-bodied man. Shovels, axes, blankets, anything that can smother flames or create a firebreak. Doc Carruthers, prepare for injuries. Mrs. Henderson," he addressed the woman who ran the boarding house, "organize the women to bring water, as much as you can carry, to the western perimeter." His authority was absolute, born of urgency and a complete lack of fear. People scrambled to obey. Ilara found herself working alongside him, not by his direct order, but by a shared, unspoken understanding of the threat. She knew the terrain better than anyone, the way the wind funneled through the low hills, the patches of particularly dense, dry brush that would act like tinder. "We need to create a break here," she shouted to Blackwood, over the roar of the approaching fire and the frantic efforts of the men, pointing to a shallow ravine that ran perpendicular to the fire's path. "If we can clear the brush on this side and light a backfire on the other, we might be able to steer it away from the well and the town." Blackwood looked at the ravine, then at her, his eyes narrowed against the stinging smoke. For a moment, she saw a flash of something akin to reliance in his gaze. "A backfire is risky. If the wind shifts—" "It's riskier not to try," Ilara insisted, her voice raw. "That fire will hit the drilling equipment in less than an hour, and then it will sweep into town." He stared at the advancing wall of orange and black for a long, tense moment. The heat was already palpable, the air thick with the smell of burning sage and pine. Then he nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. "All right, Miss Vance. Show us. Finch, reassign half the men to Miss Vance. Do exactly as she says." It was a stunning delegation of authority. In the midst of crisis, Silas Blackwood, the man who controlled everything, had just placed the fate of a significant portion of his investment, and potentially the town itself, into her hands. The next hour was a blur of frantic, exhausting labor. Ilara, her face smudged with soot, her lungs aching, directed the men, her voice hoarse but steady. They hacked at the dry brush, creating a barren strip of earth along the near side of the ravine. On the far side, with Blackwood watching intently, she and a few of the braver men carefully set a controlled line of fire, timing it to meet the advancing inferno, hoping to create a burned-out area that the main blaze could not cross. It was a desperate gamble. The wind swirled, threatening to turn their own fire against them. Embers rained down, setting small spot fires that had to be beaten out with wet blankets and frantic stomping. Ilara worked alongside the men, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve like steel. She could feel Blackwood's eyes on her, appraising, judging. This was more than just saving a well. It was about saving their home, their last vestiges of hope. Finally, with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, the main fire reached their backburn. For a terrifying few minutes, it seemed their efforts would be overwhelmed. Flames leaped high into the night sky, a terrifying wall of destruction. Then, slowly, miraculously, the backfire began to do its work. The main blaze, starved of fuel as it hit the pre-burned strip and the cleared ravine, began to falter, its advance slowing, then veering slightly northward, away from the well and the town, towards the empty, barren flats. A ragged cheer went up from the exhausted, smoke-blackened figures. They had done it. They had faced the inferno and, against all odds, turned it back. Ilara sagged against a blackened tree stump, her legs trembling, every muscle screaming in protest. She coughed, her throat raw, and wiped a grimy hand across her forehead. Through the haze, she saw Blackwood approaching her. His face was streaked with soot, his usually immaculate coat singed at the cuffs. He looked almost human. He stopped before her, the dying glow of the diverted fire casting strange shadows on his face. The usual cool reserve in his eyes was replaced by something else, something she couldn't name. Exhaustion, yes, but also a raw, unguarded intensity. "You were right, Miss Vance," he said, his voice raspy. "Your plan worked." "It was the only chance we had," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He looked out at the smoldering landscape, then back at her. "You saved more than just my drilling equipment tonight." There was no sarcasm, no calculation in his tone, only a stark statement of fact. Before Ilara could respond, Doc Carruthers hurried over. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Vance, are you all right?" We have a few men with burns, but nothing too severe, thanks to your quick thinking." Blackwood nodded. "See to them, Doctor." He turned back to Ilara. An awkward silence fell between them, filled only with the crackle of distant dying flames and the weary sighs of the men. The immediate threat was over, but the air was still charged. He had trusted her, and she had delivered. In the heat and chaos of the fire, a new, undeniable bond had been forged, one born not of contracts or ownership, but of shared peril and mutual, if unspoken, respect. He had seen her strength, her courage, her deep, unwavering commitment to this place and its people. And she, in turn, had seen him not just as a cold capitalist, but as a leader capable of decisive action and, astonishingly, of trusting another. The fire had burned away more than just brush and timber. It had seared away some of the barriers between them, leaving them both exposed, vulnerable, and irrevocably changed. The future of Redemption Gulch was still uncertain, but tonight they had faced its destruction together, and that, Ilara knew, mattered more than any deed or document. The days following the fire were imbued with a strange sense of quiet accomplishment and a new, tentative camaraderie. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind a landscape scarred by flame, but also a community subtly altered. Silas Blackwood, the aloof millionaire, had fought fire alongside them, had listened to the mayor's daughter, had even shown a flicker of what looked like gratitude. The townsfolk, who had previously viewed him with a mixture of fear and obsequious hope, now spoke of him with a grudging respect. And Ilara Vance, once seen by some as merely contrary, was now regarded as a woman of courage and practical wisdom. Blackwood himself was different, or perhaps, Ilara thought, she was simply seeing him more clearly. The cool detachment was still there, but it was occasionally breached by moments of unexpected consideration. He sought her out, not through Finch, but directly, to discuss plans for replanting the burned areas with fire-resistant native grasses, a suggestion she had made in passing. He listened, truly listened, to her ideas about establishing a small, cooperatively run market garden near the new well, once it was operational, to provide fresh produce for the town. It would require an initial investment, he'd said, his gaze analytical as he studied the rough sketches she'd drawn on a piece of butcher paper. Seeds, tools, perhaps a small storage shed. The people would provide the labor, Ilara had countered. They need purpose, Mr. Blackwood, as much as they need water or food, a chance to build something for themselves again. He had looked at her then, a long, searching look. "You believe in them, don't you, despite everything?" "I do," she said simply. "This town may be bankrupt, but its spirit isn't. Not entirely." He'd nodded slowly. "Prepare a detailed proposal, Miss Vance. Costs, potential yields, labor allocation. I will consider it." It wasn't a promise, but it was more than she had expected. The dynamic between them was shifting from adversarial to something akin to a cautious, highly pragmatic partnership. He was still the owner, his words still law, but he was increasingly willing to entertain her input, to acknowledge her unique understanding of Redemption Gulch and its inhabitants. The town itself seemed to breathe a little easier. The successful drilling of the well a few weeks later, when fresh, clear water gushed forth from the earth, was a cause for genuine celebration, the first in many years. Blackwood had even permitted a small, impromptu gathering near the wellhead, and had stood on the periphery, watching the tired but joyful faces of the townsfolk with an expression Ilara couldn't quite decipher. Pride, satisfaction, or merely the contentment of a businessman whose investment was proving sound. The true test of their evolving relationship, and of Blackwood's ultimate intentions for Redemption Gulch, arrived not in the form of fire or external speculators, but through a letter bearing an official seal from the territorial capital. Mr. Finch delivered it to Mayor Vance, his face unusually grave. The letter was from the Territorial Banking Commission, and its contents were devastating. It stated that due to irregularities discovered in the initial bankruptcy filings of Redemption Gulch, irregularities that predated Blackwood's purchase by several years, stemming from the desperate, muddled bookkeeping of a previous town council, the entire sale to Blackwood was being called into question. Furthermore, it hinted that certain powerful creditors, long thought to have written off Redemption Gulch's debts, were now, hearing of potential revitalization under Blackwood, reasserting their claims. The implication was clear. The town could be seized, its assets liquidated to satisfy these old, resurrected debts, leaving Blackwood with nothing but a worthless deed, and the townsfolk with even less, evicted from their homes, their community dissolved. A pall of despair, thicker and more suffocating than any dust storm, descended upon Redemption Gulch. It was a cruel, almost unbelievable blow. Just as a fragile hope had begun to bloom, it was threatened with utter annihilation. Mayor Vance was crushed, a broken man. The townsfolk were numb with disbelief and fear. All eyes turned to Silas Blackwood. What would he do? Would he cut his losses, abandon this problematic acquisition, as any sensible businessman might? He had already invested significantly, but to fight a legal battle against powerful, entrenched interests, for a town that was, by its own admission, built on a foundation of past fiscal mismanagement, seemed a fool's errand. Blackwood summoned Ilara and her father to the hotel. His face was grim, etched with lines of weariness she hadn't seen before, not even during the fire. The letter lay on the table between them. "This is unfortunate," Blackwood said, his voice flat. Mayor Vance could only shake his head, speechless with misery. Ilara felt a cold dread grip her. This was it. This was the moment Blackwood would walk away, and she couldn't blame him. He was a businessman after all. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Blackwood looked at her, his grey eyes piercing. "The irregularities they cite are genuine. My own lawyers have reviewed the preliminary reports. The town's founding charter and subsequent financial records are a mess. Combating these claims will be expensive, time-consuming, and the outcome uncertain." "So, you'll relinquish your claim?" Mayor Vance finally whispered, his voice hoarse. Blackwood was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the damning letter. Ilara watched him, her heart aching. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe that perhaps he was different, that Redemption Gulch meant more to him than just another entry in his ledger. Now, that hope felt like a foolish, naive dream. Then, Blackwood lifted his head, his jaw set. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I will not." Ilara stared at him, stunned. Her father gasped. "But why?" Ilara breathed. "You could lose everything you've put into this place." Blackwood's gaze met hers, and for the first time she saw not the cool calculator, not the remote tycoon, but something raw and intensely personal. "Because, Miss Vance," he said slowly, "I made a deal. I bought this town, and when Silas Blackwood makes a deal, he sees it through. Besides," a ghost of his rare wry smile touched his lips, "it has become an interesting challenge." He paused, and his next words were directed solely at her. "And perhaps there are assets here that cannot be quantified on a balance sheet, assets worth fighting for." Ilara felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees, relief, gratitude, and a profound, unexpected surge of admiration. He wasn't just fighting for his investment, he was fighting for them, for Redemption Gulch, for the fragile future they had begun to build together. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. Blackwood's smile widened slightly. "We, Miss Vance? Are you offering your services?" "This is my home, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her chin lifting with familiar resolve. "These are my people. If there's a fight to be had, I'm in it." He nodded, a new light in his eyes. "Good, because I have a feeling I'm going to need your resourcefulness more than ever. Finch is already on his way to Prescott with my preliminary response. But we'll need more. We'll need every piece of documentation, every local testimony, every bit of historical leverage we can find to prove that Redemption Gulch, despite its past follies, has a viable future under its current stewardship, a future these creditors had long since abandoned any claim to." He stood, a renewed energy about him. "This will not be easy. They will try to bury us in legal maneuvers, to bleed us dry. But they underestimate us." He looked from Mayor Vance's stunned but hopeful face to Ilara's determined one. "They underestimate Redemption Gulch, and they underestimate what we can do when we stand together." In that moment, the lines of owner and owned, of millionaire and mayor's daughter, blurred into insignificance. They were allies, united against a common threat, fighting not just for a piece of land or a collection of buildings, but for the very idea of a community's right to exist, to redeem itself. The decision was made. They would fight. And as Ilara met Silas Blackwood's gaze, she knew that whatever the outcome, Redemption Gulch would not fall without a struggle, and that its fiercest defenders were now, unexpectedly, standing side by side. The battle for Redemption Gulch was fought not with fire and shovels, but with depositions, affidavits, and an unending stream of legal correspondence ferried back and forth from Prescott by a weary Mr. Finch. Silas Blackwood threw the full weight of his considerable resources into the fight. He hired the best lawyers in the territory, men who specialized in unraveling tangled land claims and combating predatory creditors. But it was Ilara's intimate knowledge of the town's history, her meticulous recall of names, dates, and long-forgotten agreements that often provided the crucial pieces of the puzzle. She spent countless hours poring over dusty ledgers in the mayor's office, her grandfather's meticulously kept journals, and forgotten files stored in the attic of the old mercantile. She interviewed the town's oldest residents, patiently coaxing out faded memories that sometimes held the key to disproving a creditor's claim or establishing a prior right. Blackwood, initially skeptical of the value of such anecdotal evidence, soon came to appreciate her diligence and the surprising legal weight her discoveries often carried. He began to spend evenings with her and her father in the small parlor of the Vance house, not as the town's owner, but as a co-strategist, spreading out maps and documents on the worn kitchen table, the three of them working late into the night under the flickering lamplight. During these intense sessions, the last vestiges of formality between Ilara and Blackwood eroded. He was no longer just Mr. Blackwood, but Silas, at his quiet insistence. And he, in turn, began to call her Ilara, his voice softening almost imperceptibly when he did so. They discovered a surprising intellectual compatibility, their minds working in tandem to dissect complex legal arguments or anticipate the creditor's next move. Her father, initially awed and intimidated, found his own voice, contributing his decades of experience as mayor, his understanding of the town's unwritten laws and social fabric. There were setbacks, moments when it seemed the faceless, powerful forces arrayed against them would inevitably prevail. One particularly damaging claim, based on a massive, unpaid loan taken out by a long-dead town council for a railroad spur that was never built, threatened to bankrupt them completely. Despair settled over the Vance household. Even Silas looked grim. It was Ilara, sifting through a box of her grandmother's keepsakes, who found the faded, almost overlooked letter. It was from the very railroad company that had supposedly issued the loan, written years later, explicitly forgiving the debt in exchange for rights of way through other, more prosperous territories they had subsequently acquired. The original loan document had been loudly trumpeted by the creditors. This quiet letter of forgiveness had been conveniently lost. When Ilara presented it to Silas, his expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then, a slow smile spread across his face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his usually austere features. "Ilara," he said, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Admiration, gratitude, perhaps something more. You are remarkable." He took the letter, his fingers brushing hers, a brief, electrifying contact. "This," he said, holding it up, "this changes everything." The letter of forgiveness was the turning point. Armed with this undeniable proof of misrepresentation, Blackwood's lawyers went on the offensive. The creditors, faced with exposure of their fraudulent claims and the prospect of a costly, embarrassing public legal battle against a determined and very wealthy opponent, began to retreat. One by one, their claims were withdrawn or settled for nominal sums. The day Mr. Finch arrived with the final dispatch from Prescott, confirming that all outstanding claims against Redemption Gulch had been legally nullified, and Silas Blackwood's ownership unequivocally affirmed, a quiet but profound wave of relief swept through the town. There was no boisterous celebration, just a collective, heartfelt sigh. They had faced oblivion, and, through a combination of Silas's wealth and determination, and Ilara's unwavering spirit and knowledge, they had survived. That evening, Silas walked with Ilara to the bluff overlooking Redemption Gulch, the same spot where she had once seen him standing alone at dawn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft violet. The new well gurgled softly in the distance, a sound of life and promise. The small experimental market garden Ilara had started nearby showed rows of tender green shoots. "We did it," Ilara said softly, more to herself than to him. Silas stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. "You did it, Ilara," he corrected quietly. "Your knowledge, your tenacity, I merely provided the resources." She turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "It was a partnership, Silas, one I never would have expected." He met her gaze, his own eyes, usually so guarded, now open and surprisingly warm in the fading light. "Nor I." He paused, then said, "Redemption Gulch has a future now. A real one." "Thanks to you," she acknowledged. "You didn't have to fight for it. You could have walked away." Perhaps the old Silas Blackwood would have. He admitted, a hint of self-reflection in his tone. But then, the old Silas Blackwood hadn't met the mayor's daughter of Redemption Gulch. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with unspoken understanding. The town below, nestled in the curve of the valley, was quiet, lights beginning to flicker on in the windows. It was still a small, struggling place, but it was theirs, saved not just by money, but by a shared belief in its worth. "What now?" Ilara asked, her voice gentle. Silas looked out at the town, then back at her, his expression serious but with an undercurrent of something new, hope, perhaps, or even affection. "Now," he said, "we build, together, if you're willing." It wasn't a proposal of marriage, not in the conventional sense. It was an offer of continued partnership, a recognition of her vital role in the town's future and his own. It was an acknowledgement that he, Silas Blackwood, the man who bought towns, had found something in Redemption Gulch and in its stubborn, intelligent mayor's daughter that he valued more than any deed or balance sheet. Ilara felt a warmth spread through her, chasing away the last shadows of doubt and mistrust. She looked at the man beside her, no longer seeing the cold millionaire who had sought to buy her along with her town, but a complex, unexpectedly honorable man who had, against all odds, become its staunchest defender. She saw a partner, she saw a future. "I'm willing, Silas," she said, her voice clear and strong as the prairie wind. He offered her his arm, a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply respectful. As they walked back towards the twinkling lights of Redemption Gulch, Ilara knew that the deal for the town had indeed been irrevocably altered. It was no longer about ownership, but about stewardship, about shared purpose. And the mayor's daughter, who had refused to be part of the original bargain, had just become its most essential and willing component. The path ahead would be challenging, but they would face it together, two unlikely allies who had found in the heart of a bankrupt town something far more valuable than either had ever imagined. A chance for true redemption, and a partnership forged in fire and faith. The sun dipped below the distant, jagged peaks, and a cool evening breeze rustled the new leaves in the small garden by the well. He watched her for a moment as she checked on a row of young tomato plants, her movements efficient and filled with a quiet care. He'd come to Redemption Gulch to acquire an asset, another piece in his vast portfolio. He'd stayed and fought for it, he realized now, not for the land or the potential profit, but for the fierce, unyielding spirit embodied by the woman before him, a spirit that had somehow reawakened his own. He had bought a town, but Ilara Vance had shown him what it meant to truly invest in a community, in its people, in its heart. And in doing so, she had, quite unexpectedly, claimed a part of his. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.